that Ivan owned, and they were driving along the Hume Highway, and they came to a particular point. All of a sudden, he noticed that the atmosphere in the vehicle changed. Ivan stopped the car, got out of the driver's side and was rummaging around underneath his seat, and all of a sudden produced a pistol.
Onions was terrified and made a split-second decision.
And he decided that no matter what, he was not going to stay in that car. He just jumped out of that car and ran up the Hume Highway, zigzagging backwards and forwards as he'd been told to do in the Navy. If you're being fired at by the enemy and you're running away, then you don't just run in a straight line, you zigzag. And he was zigzagging as he was running, and he heard 2 shots ring out.
In broad daylight on a busy highway, Ivan ruthlessly opened fire. A car finally stopped, and Paul Onions jumped in. The driver had inadvertently saved him, not only from hours of torture, but also from certain death. He was taken to the local police station, where he gave a statement. It was filed among the other petty crimes, and it would be another 4 years before police realized just how vital that statement would be. Following Onion's escape, there were no murders for a year. While this one British backpacker was lucky to get away, 2 more wouldn't be so fortunate. Caroline Clarke was the 21-year-old daughter of Ian and Jackie Clarke. A bright and bubbly girl, she loved life and always dreamed of traveling to Australia.
Before she was even a teenager, Australia was always the goal, sort of age 10 upwards, whether it was a diet of neighbours and home and away, I don't know.
Off she went, and she was having a wonderful time.
She met Welsh-born nanny Joanne Walters in King's Cross, and they decided to go fruit picking together. To save on cash, they hitchhiked against Caroline's parents' advice.
You know, we'd always talked about hitchhiking as something that should not be encouraged, and we'd always said to Caroline, look, whatever you do, you must never do this on your own. We'd much rather she went on public transport, you know, if it meant working for a bit longer to get the money to pay for the fare. But, well, she didn't.
For once, there wasn't safety in numbers. On Saturday, April 18th, 1992, both girls were seen heading toward King's Cross Station, carrying sleeping bags and a tent. They were never seen alive again. 6 weeks later, and with no contact from Caroline, the Clarkes began to get worried.
She always rang on family birthdays just to say hello and, you know, happy birthday. So when Emma didn't get a call, we thought, that's a little strange. That's
when the alarm bells really started ringing, and we started putting into place, you know, a serious search.
The Clarkes did everything possible in their search for their youngest daughter.
We got flybills made up with the girls' photographs and so on, and sent them out to all the major backpacking hostels, big bundles of them, and said, when anybody's moving from here, will you ask them to take a bundle and move on to the next place and get them to put them. And so they spread across Australia remarkably quickly.
You can't believe anything's gone wrong, you know. You don't want to think anything's gone wrong, but of course as the weeks turned into months.
I don't think we ever really, until quite late on, faced up to the fact that they weren't coming back.
You are sort of in a state of limbo, I must say. Not a nice time.
4 months later, Caroline would be found.
You know, a different kind of anguish comes in. You know they're dead, and so you can start to mourn them.
2 cross-country runners discovered the girls' remains in the Belanglo Forest, near where Paul Onions had his narrow escape 2 years earlier. Ian and Jackie Clarke knew their daughter had been brutally murdered, but now their question was, by whom?
We knew the broad outline of what had happened to her, and I think that was horrid, because it was such an evil and disgusting event, really, that you start reliving it on their behalf, and you conjure up what they'd gone through.
After the discovery of the girls' bodies in the forest, the police set up Task Force Air to find the killer. The task force was headed by one of Australia's most experienced major crime detectives, Commander Clive Small.
They had multiple bullet wounds and multiple stab wounds, as did most of the victims. It shows a pattern of behaviour that goes clearly beyond just the killing of a person, and that the satisfaction continues well after the actual death of the person.
Two brutal murders, but no hard evidence and no witnesses. Investigators called in leading Australian forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton. Milton has over 20 years' experience in profiling serial killers. He was driven back to the scene of the crime to get a feel for the horrific events that had occurred there. He sat undisturbed, thinking over all the information he'd been told about the murders.
This was where the body of Miss Walters was found, and she was lying under the rock. The injuries were very severe and multiple stab wounds. There was one stab wound to the neck that would have been immediately fatal. I think it was violence for the sake of violence, and someone who enjoyed an explosion of violence. Disarrangement of the clothing suggests that there was a sexual element to it. That's as far as one can go. But there did seem to be that combination of the two factors. Whatever was done was probably of a humiliating nature, because that was what Ivan most likely did with his victims. It was to get power more than anything else, and that Ivan Maddock was a person who was intent on getting power over his victims rather than anything else.
Caroline Clarke's body was found just 70 yards away. It too was left in a special position that meant something to the killer.
She was lying face down with one arm up and her head on her hand, and she'd been repeatedly shot through the head. The autopsy results showed different entry points to the skull. It suggests that the killer had moved the head in order to do what pleased him. It had the impression of being a very deliberate, cold and calculated murder. Well, it's not unknown for people who commit serial offences like this to arrange the bodies in a particular way, and there was some similarity between Miss Walters and Miss Clarke in that both were lying face down, and I think they had their arms raised up with their hands somewhere in the vicinity of their head. Now, evidently that had some sort of significance for the murderer.
Dr. Milton started to build a profile that would prove vital in the eventual capture of the killer. He believes that the way the victims were killed meant that two people had to be responsible.
I said, well, here are two people who are used to living with violence, who probably have a criminal record, who don't mind what they do to others, who get pleasure from it. And the fact that one body was at some distance from the other suggested that if there were two offenders, that maybe the second one had a reason to feel a bit shy of what the other would feel about him. In regard to dominance, the sadistic and calculated person is more likely to dominate the impulsive, and a more openly aggressive person. And that gave me the hypothesis that there were two killers, one of whom was perhaps a bit older and more dominant, sadistic and cold, very, very violent but very restrained, and the other one of a more spontaneous, impulsive nature.
The profile indicated that the killer was someone who loved guns but hated women, someone who loved power but hated authority. Clive Small conducted an extensive search of past criminal records for people who might fit that profile and who also lived close to the Belanglo Forest.
Rod was very close on a number of points. He'd said that the person would probably be a blue-collar worker, would probably be a hard worker, would be a loner. We were dealing with a person who knew the forest area very well. We were dealing with a person who probably knew the Liverpool area very well because that's where the victims were being picked up, and that led us to believe that the person lived in the area. We also had good reason to believe that the person was very familiar with firearms and was probably somewhat of a fanatic. We had the Malat family nominated to us as a family we should look at.
Despite the suspicions surrounding the Malats, there was no evidence and no witnesses. The police therefore couldn't get a warrant to search any of the Malat homes. The only course of action they could take was to keep Ivan Malat under surveillance.
We looked at all members of the Malat family. What we found was that Ivan was the only person who had an opportunity on every occasion. The other brothers all had alibis on at least a number of occasions.
A year later, a bushwalker found the skeletal remains of two more bodies. They were later identified as missing Australians Deborah Everist and James Gibson. As with Clarke and Walters, they had both been killed by multiple stab wounds, and their bodies covered up with debris. A serial killer was at large.
The pattern at each scene was quite similar. What we found was that their personal clothing or luggage, their backpacks and that, were taken. We found that in most cases, both a knife and firearms had been used to commit the murders. A number of people had been both stabbed and shot. You have found indications that the victims had been tied up in some fashion, and that was a common pattern.
Police suspected there were more bodies to be found. One of the biggest searches in Australia's history had begun.
We wanted to make sure that when we did the forest this time, there was nothing left unchecked. The search was limited by natural barriers and boundaries. For example, some fire trails led to a gorge, which are several hundred feet down, so that we couldn't go any further than that. Others took us to roadways and other natural barriers so that we could say, with some degree of comfort, that the whole of the forest, for practical purposes, had been searched.
Over 300 police officers searched 30 miles of fire track in the Belanglo State Forest, often on their hands and knees as they pushed their way through the dense terrain. Within a month, the remains of a further 3 victims had been found, bringing the total to 7. Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, and Anja Habschied were finally found, dead. Some victims were bludgeoned, some were strangled, others were shot and stabbed. Many were sexually assaulted. One was decapitated. The more Malat killed, the more ferocious the assaults became.
What we found was that the crime scenes tended to get a bit larger, that there appeared to have been more activity at each scene, that the murders themselves became more sophisticated and more ritualistic, and more time was being spent at the scene by the murderer.
In November 1993, the police appealed to the public for help in tracking down this brutal killer. They received 5,119 calls. One of the calls was from British backpacker Paul Onions, the man who had been robbed but managed to get away with his life. He saw in the newspaper that the remains of Clarke and Walters had been found in the Belanglo State Forest, the same place he had been attacked years earlier.